Today's Friday, July 28th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This morning, my wife and I had another successful meeting with our accreditation evaluator as we move now into the candidacy process and get ready for our evaluation for accreditation, which is probably going to take place in February of 2024. As we were going through our meeting this morning, I was taking some notes and jotting down thoughts as we discussed the next step of the accreditation process. And it really started to dawn on me that over the past year or two, I've been stumbling into this, or I should say constantly bumping into this thought about how the modern world works, how the modern world of study and work is changing. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit because I think it's very important. And I think my own experience in education as a student and also as an educator, as both a teacher and a school administrator, have clarified for me this development in modern society that I'm realizing more and more is true. And I find that Christians, rather than taking advantage of these changes which really work to their benefit, they're actually resisting them because they don't like the implications of them. And it's exposing some problems in Christian culture. And that's what I'd like to talk about. So bear with me as I kind of develop this a little bit and clarify what I'd like to share with you. If we think back to the ancient world, medieval world, even early America, education was a privilege. Education was a privilege that was enjoyed by those who were connected in society. Education was not a right. Education was not common. Most people in society were not educated. William Cobbett, who was an old English writer and politician, said that 90% of men need to earn a living with their hands, and only 10% will ever make a living using their minds. And that's been a rule in society all through human history until the 1850s, when the madness of democracy and eventually of industrialization led politically minded people to promote the idea of compulsory education for all children, where the whole entire population of children were taken out of factories, out of fields, out of homes, and sent to school. Again, this was never done in the history of the world until the 19th century. It's hard to comprehend that because for most of us, we take this idea of compulsory education for granted. But hardly anyone ever went to school. Even when you watch an old TV show like Little House on the Prairie, it seems like a long time ago, but that was the middle of the 19th century. Things were backwards in Little House because people were living on the prairie as America was being developed in the Midwest. But the world was already modern in the cities and in Europe. But even in Little House, even in that show, in the middle of the 19th century, the idea of compulsory education was already in place. All the kids were going to school. the idea of public schooling was already established. And in modern circles, we take this for granted. We think that it's just normal that all kids go to school. But we've got to realize historically that that was never the case. I would argue that most kids actually should not be in school, because I think for most kids it is a real waste of their time and source of all kinds of bad habits. But what I'd like to point out and emphasize here is that throughout history, education was a privilege, and very few had access to it. You either had to come from a connected family, a noble family that had the money or connections to provide the children, or some of the children, not even all of the children, with an education. Or you had to be some extraordinarily gifted individual where someone would notice your gifts and out of their own goodwill and generosity would work to provide for you to go and receive an education. So education was a privilege that very few had access to. And you can imagine that this realization was a source of frustration to many people, because there may have been gifted individuals or individuals who wanted the opportunity to study and be cultured and be sent to the big city to go to school or to the university, and it just was off the table. It wasn't even an option for them. And so education was understood not necessarily as an achievement, but as a privilege. And many had to live with no opportunity to have an education. Now, in the spirit of America, we love to have this idea of egalitarianism, that everyone is equal, everyone deserves the same opportunity, equal opportunity. We even go beyond that in modern society with the idea of affirmative action, where we go past equal opportunity and say that some individuals should be even given more opportunity because they come from a minority group or some socio-economic situation that gives them a disadvantage, and so on. We've gone even beyond the idea of equal opportunity, even though throughout history there was never any notion of a right to education in society. And really, for all of the billions and billions of dollars our country spends on this idea of compulsory education, the results are really disgusting. To think about the amount of money, public funding spent on education for almost non-existent results. And we can boast about things like, well, such and such a percentage of the population is able to read, but they don't read. So it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. But that's how this democratic society works. And ultimately, the public school system is just a gigantic industry, and the one thing it produces is jobs for educators. It's much more about producing jobs for adults than it is for educating children. But anyway, again, the focus that I want to emphasize is that throughout history, education was a privilege that very few had access to. It wasn't so much about merit as it was about good luck or good connections. And the same was true with work. The same was true with work. There was no open market. There was no competition. It wasn't a matter of whoever makes the best mousetrap makes the money. There was no capitalistic system. There was no stock market. The king, in a monarchy, the king owned everything and divided up the land and the resources among people that he judged to be capable of making good use of them for his own benefit, for the benefit and welfare of his kingdom. And usually those opportunities remained in the same families across generations. A person didn't save up money and go buy land to farm. Land was inherited, and the only people who actually worked on land were peasants who didn't own the land they worked on. The landowners made their living by collecting tithes from the produce of the workers of the land. And the more land you had, the more money you collected, and that determined a man's wealth. So for example, when we watch a movie or read a story like Pride and Prejudice, and we see Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, and they talk about how much they have, 10,000 a year. What that means is they own an estate of such a size that the income collected through the use of that land makes them very wealthy. And that's how a gentleman gained great wealth. So the opportunity to work was largely determined by your birth. And that's why when we talk about ancient culture or even medieval culture, we always associate the trade of a man with the trade of his father. We say Jesus was a carpenter, not because we have any evidence of Jesus making any furniture, but because his father was a carpenter. And so it's understood in ancient culture that the son does what the father does unless some extraordinary circumstance leads him into some other kind of work. But the opportunity to work in a certain way or do a certain work was not determined by effort. It was not a meritocracy. Meritocracy is an American idea. Opportunity was limited, usually, as I said, by birth or family connections or extraordinary individual talents. There's a proverb that says, "See a man who excels at his work, he will stand before kings." So there's an opportunity where an extraordinarily talented individual could be called up, as it were, but that was very rare. A good example we find in the Old Testament. We find a couple good examples, actually. First, in the story of the life of Joseph in Genesis, we see that he's arrested and imprisoned, and while he's in prison, it's revealed to his fellow prisoners that the Spirit of God dwells in him, and he's able to interpret men's dreams. And because of this extraordinary skill, he's eventually called up to the court of Pharaoh in Egypt. So that's an example of promotion because of some obviously extraordinary skill. Another example in the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel, David is known for his skillful music. And when King Saul is suffering the torment of the evil spirits, one of the men in King Saul's court says to him that he knows of a boy who's an extraordinary musician. And so they call for David and bring him into the presence of the king because of his skill as a musician. So we see how that society worked. If you were fortunate and your talent was so extraordinary that you could get noticed, you could get promoted. We even see this among servants in the ancient world. There were some servants who because of their excellent service and faithfulness to their masters, would be given their freedom as an award. And because they were already known as a servant of some great man, they had an easy way to actually connect with the friends of that great man. So there were opportunities for social mobility, but they were very difficult and rare and required really extraordinary skills or even good luck. And throughout ancient history, throughout medieval history, that's how life was understood. People were content in their place because it was very, very difficult to rise to a different level in society. And you were normally advised not to try to do so because you would end up making a fool of yourself or getting yourself into trouble. So I want to focus on this idea that throughout history, upward social mobility or success or wealth or influence was largely predetermined by your birth, the family that you were a member of, what your family did, what connections your family had, and so on. It wasn't so much a contest of who's the hardest individual worker or the most talented individual. And so individual performance, individual achievement was not so significant. Everyone, for the most part, was content with their lot, and their job was really just to be faithful where they are, and if they proved faithful in the sphere where they were, they might have the opportunity to be invited into a bigger sphere. And that's how society worked. But in America, that idea was challenged. The idea where opportunity is really limited by birth and connections was challenged, and the founding fathers in America had a dream, especially Jefferson. They had a dream of creating a society that was meritocratic, that was ruled by individual achievement, where whoever was best at a thing was honored by his skill, and there were no limitations set upon individuals that would prevent the country from having all of the best individuals in the most important places. It was a theory of how society could work, a meritocracy. And that word, just so it's clear, is meritocracy, M-E-R-I-T, M-E-R-I-T, meritocracy. Rule by merit. Now that's a theory, that's an idea, that's an ideal or a dream. But in reality, it's largely nonsense. And really, once we clear away all of the smoke and noise of all of this political talk and all of this American fantasy language, we find that really nothing has changed. Nothing really changed. Because even if you have skill, there's still all kinds of other things you need that you don't have access to. Even if you have an idea, the research and development required to invent something takes lots of money that you may not have. Even if you're highly skilled, let's say as a musician or an athlete, the spots that are available in the local ballet or in the local theater are very limited. And it's not necessarily in the best interest of the directors of these programs to give opportunities to extremely talented but unconnected individuals because the directors of these programs are thinking of their own advantages. And they're not interested in taking risks on individuals as much as they're interested in securing advantages for themselves. So if we're going to choose who's going to get to play Clara at the Christmas Nutcracker Ballet, we could choose to have the mayor's daughter play the leading part, or we can choose some poor girl who's actually the most talented ballerina. And very few ballet schools are going to do that for obvious reasons. And so we can have all the first graders stand around and talk about what they'd like to be when they grow up. But the reality for most of American history, in spite of all of this noise about meritocracy and equality, if Tommy's born in a family where his father's left him and his mother's working at the mall, and they barely have enough money for him to have a place to live, his chances of becoming a doctor are extremely small. And so all of that cute first grade talk doesn't play out in the end. And usually everyone settles into a place in life that could have been predicted when they were in first grade. We don't like to say that because it sounds discriminatory and anti-American, but it's true. There are real-world obstacles that have to be overcome, and in order to overcome them, we're brought back to the old world privileges, connections, and so forth. That's how society must work. However, modern technology is changing that. Modern technology is changing this. Modern technology is actually changing this and creating more of a meritocratic society. And nobody likes it. Nobody likes the idea because it exposes a laziness and lack of responsibility among people when the playing field really is made level. The opportunities really are accessible to everyone. And it really does become a matter of who gets the work done first and best, which is what we're seeing as technology continues to develop, because the computer removes so much of the cost of education, so much of the cost of starting a business or doing business, advertising, selling things, delivering things, on and on. Because the internet and computers and smartphones and wireless technology have reduced so much of the cost of starting things and getting education and so on, it really has created a level playing field. And modern people, especially those who have resources, they don't want to admit that this is so. They like pretending that the old world obstacles are still in place and that they're in the circumstances that they're in because it's just their lot in life and there's really nothing they can do about it. They like to actually pretend that there are obstacles that they can't get around. They like to pretend that they're dependent on help that they don't actually need. They like to pretend that they lack resources to pursue things they should pursue. On the farm here, one time back some years ago, we used to keep a herd of sheep. These beautiful Leicester long wool sheep. And we had them out in the pasture, and we had an area fenced out for them with electric fencing that would keep them in one clean pasture, because we couldn't allow them to go through the woods and things like that, because their wool would pick up all kinds of weeds and sticks and grass and junk, and it would mess up their wool. So we had to keep them in a clean pasture. And we had an area that was fenced out just for the long wools. And then one day we decided to open up that pasture, and we took down one line of fencing so that they could move around into a different field. We took the fence line down, but the sheep, because they had been trained by that fence line, and they had become accustomed to going up to that spot and then turning around and going back out to the center of the pasture, when we took the fence line down, those sheep refused to walk across that old fence line. And we had quite a bit of fun watching them. We would try to push them across, call them across, lure them across, and they just wouldn't cross that line, because in the past they had either run into that fence and been shocked by it because it was an electric fence, or they just learned from habit that they don't go over there. But the fence line was taken away, and yet the sheep would not cross that line, even though there was nothing in the way anymore. And that's how modern people continue to live today. Many of the fence lines that used to block people from doing things no longer exist. And what people do is they pretend that these lines still exist. They pretend because they've excused themselves from responsibilities. They've excused themselves from any need to work to advance, because they've just said, well, my lot's already marked out for me. The fence lines are already run where they are, and I'm content in my little pasture here. But then when the shepherd takes down the fence line and they're told, hey, go ahead, you can go out further, they're like, no, this is our pasture. This is where we're supposed to stay. We think we're just going to stay put here because, that's not our pasture over there. And it's like, no, that is your pasture now. There's no more fence line. You can go further. But they make excuses for staying where they are. And this is what modern people are doing. The fence lines have been taken down. Access is open to everybody. And the parents and the children, especially with regard to education, are still talking about education, still acting like it's 1980 or 1990. They're still looking for the things that were needed for education 40 years ago. They're still looking for the services that were necessary 40 years ago. And these things aren't even necessary anymore. The fence lines have been taken down. The way things worked 40 years ago are no longer the ways things work. But everyone is playing this game, acting like we're still living in 1990. And I'll give you some examples. Let me give you some examples. And I'll explain how I've come to learn this in my own life. When I was 18 years old, Remember, I was raised in a family where there was no education. I was just sent to public school. Neither of my parents went to college. They were both simple entry-level workers in their careers. But I always had intellectual gifts, even as a young kid. My sisters didn't. My sisters weren't able to go to college. They weren't good students. They both work retail jobs as adults. It was just me in my family, and I had no direction, no support, no encouragement in education, but I felt that I should pursue an education. I felt I had the ability. I was always put in honors classes. All of my classmates were going to top schools. And then there was me, this sort of misfit, this intellectually gifted individual who comes from a family that was unlike any of the families of the kids who were in my classes. I had no idea how college worked. I had no money. I had no resources. It was just me. And I didn't realize how much this was true until in high school, when we took the SAT tests. I had one of the highest scores in my high school. And I really didn't even know what I was doing. I was just intellectually gifted. And so I wasn't encouraged by my parents to study. I didn't have good grades because there was no discipline or accountability. I was just left to myself. So I was smart enough to stay in honors classes, but I didn't get good grades. I fooled around, and I was the high school class clown. I used my wit to have fun. But as I got to age 17, 18, I started to mature, and my conversion started. And I started to think about what I was going to do with my life, and it became clear to me that I needed to pursue something intellectual. But I had no knowledge, no counsel, no financial assistance. I had nothing to pursue any kind of academic life. And so I went to college and had to figure out everything on my own. With, like I said, no money, no direction, no experience. I couldn't ask my parents for advice or anything like that. No one in my family had any clue how college even worked. So I just had to go. And I just had to knock on doors and make phone calls and send emails as the internet developed a few years into my college career. But I just had to ask, seek, and knock at every step. And what I often found was that the things that were written in the policy manuals, the things that were written in the student directories, all of the rules and regulations, they really weren't rules and regulations. They were just the normal policies. And if someone would ask, they would learn that there are other ways to get things done. So let me give you an example. Out of high school, I was denied admission to Rutgers University. I didn't have the grades. My grade point average in high school was a 2.3. My girlfriend, who became my wife, she got admitted to Rutgers because even though her SAT score was several hundred points lower than mine, she had good grades in school. She came from an educated family, went to college, had support for studies, was accountable for her grades. She had good grades, low SAT score. She was admitted. I had a high SAT score, low grades. I was denied. So I had to go to a private college. I didn't want to go to this small college, but it was my only option. So I went. Took me a semester or two to figure out how college worked. And then I decided that I wanted to transfer. I wanted to go to a good college. I wanted to go to Rutgers. So there was a girl I worked with in my part-time job. I worked at a sporting goods store. She went to Rutgers, and I started asking her about getting admitted to Rutgers. And she told me that there's one college in the Rutgers system that's intended for adult students. It's a part-time college. It's called University College. And that college exists for part-time students. And so she told me, why don't you just apply to the part-time college? And as I looked at the application rules, it's called Adult University, the adult college within the Rutgers University. And I'm 19 years old, I'm an adult. And so even though I didn't know whether I would get admitted or not, I'd already been denied before. And my grades still weren't that great because I really was going through my conversion at that time, didn't know what was going on in my life. I decided to apply to this part-time adult college at Rutgers, and I was admitted. So all of a sudden, I'm admitted to Rutgers. I got myself into Rutgers through a back door. And this is sort of the story of my life. I got myself into Rutgers through a back door as a part-time adult student. So I was allowed to take up to 12 credits, since 13 was considered full-time. So I took 12 credits, and I got straight A's at Rutgers University because, again, I was progressing through my conversion at this time, and by God's grace, all of that intellectual potential that I had when I was younger was starting to find its purpose. And I suddenly found myself as a student who could easily earn straight A's. But I was enrolled in the part-time adult college. So I went to the director of this part-time adult college, showed them my grades, that I was getting straight A's, and I asked if I could take more courses, if I could take 15 credits. And the director gave me permission to take 15 credits. So now, by just asking something that was not stated anywhere in any policy manual, I was taking full-time credits as a student enrolled in a part-time college. I was a full-time Rutgers University student, even though I was enrolled in a part-time adult college. When I found, as I said, that the fence line really didn't exist, I stepped across the line. And then I went on to study at Rutgers for the rest of my time. And not only did I graduate, but I graduated at the top of my class and was inducted into the university's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. But it started with a question. It started with a question of, is this line really unmovable? And when I asked, the answer was no. If you want to go further, if you want to step across that line, we're willing to move that line for you. And again, because I had no money, no connections, no advice, no experience to turn to, I was forced to do everything that way. I was forced to just ask. If I got to a point where I realized that the policies or the rules or the lines seemed to say that this was the end of my journey, if I knocked on a door, made a phone call, or sent an email, I found restrictions taken away. I found policies able to be bypassed by the signature of an individual. And I learned never to pay much attention to policies or rules, because Policies and rules are made for the minimum achievers. They're made for the lazy people. They're not made for the workers. They're not made for the overachievers. And as I went through college and got started in my career teaching, my wife started to refer to these things as what she called Bill Michael rules, because she would always laugh because she's the kind of person who lives by the policy manual. And she would always tell me, no, you can't do that. You have to do this. That's the rule says that you have to do this. And I would just say, well, let me go talk to them. Let me send an email. Let me make a phone call and see if that's really true. Because I usually find that those rules are not really true. That's how I got through college. Even while in college, I got permission from the department chairperson to not attend classes. Because I couldn't do both. I couldn't afford to go to classes all the time and study and work as I had to. So I just asked for permission because I was a straight A student. I asked if I could be excused from class attendance. And the department chairperson agreed to it. And then, when it was time to work, Dania and I were already married. I had no money still. And I realized that I needed to find a way to work. So my college professors actually wrote recommendation letters for me that urged a private school to hire me as the classics teacher before I even had my degree. So I had a full-time teaching position before I had my degree because of the recommendation of my teachers. And even though the school policies said that degrees were required for teaching positions, that rule was changed or bypassed when I needed a job. And that's just continued through my life. When I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, the same sort of things. I would see the policies, I would read the rules, and I would just say to myself, how can I know if that's really a fixed rule unless I ask? And lo and behold, when I would go talk to somebody or send a letter or make a phone call, I would find that they were willing to work with me because they could tell that I was not looking for a way around minimum requirements, but I was actually aiming to do more. And as soon as they saw that I was eager to be compliant, I was respectful to their position, I was respectful to the rules, but I was sincerely asking about being able to pursue an opportunity that was within my capabilities and yet restricted in some way by a policy. If we could bypass that policy, I always have found that the people in authority were willing to work with me and make some special arrangements or some special permissions. And that there was almost never a situation where an obstacle proved to be unmovable. There's one line in the film of the life of Teresa of Avila that I enjoyed. I don't know that many people would pay attention to it, but I did because of these experiences of mine. When she was going through the work of reforming the convents, and there was all of this practical work that needed to be done. They needed to find buildings, they needed to renovate buildings, they needed to get control of properties and get things past whatever regulations were. She would just sort of march past all that stuff. And there's one scene where she says, all human rules are just like houses built out of matchsticks. They're not real. They're not real. They're not intended, she would say, they're not intended for God's people. And so she would go about her work always confident that there was a way through everything if she would just persevere. And I found that quote of hers to be a very clear description of my own experience, because that's how I feel about things. For example, when my oldest kids were getting into their teenage years, I wanted to provide them with a schooling arrangement. So I started the first private school, in the first Catholic school in my county. I started it by myself. And the reason why I was able to start it, when everyone would think, how can you possibly do that? Like, aren't there facilities regulations and all kinds of inspections that need to be passed and all this? Yeah, there are. There are. And it cost me a little bit of money. But once I started talking to the inspectors, and again, they saw that I respected them and I respected the law, but I was working with a limited set of resources. So it wasn't a desire to defy any laws. It wasn't some kind of get-rich-quick scheme that I was after. I was sincerely seeking to establish a school. As soon as we would start talking, I would find that they were always willing to work with me. They would accept some wacky plan for phase 1. They'd accept some plan for phase 2. And there was never really an obstacle. But for the people around me, everything looked like an obstacle. And I think that pride makes us afraid to beg, to put it simply. To beg. And begging just means to ask. To ask someone who has something or who has the power to do something, to ask them to give it to us. Ask them to help us. And people, in my opinion, are generally eager to do good. They want to be the good guys. And if they're given the opportunity to help, they're willing to do so. Whereas I think most people, they see the obstacle, they see the policy, and rather than think, well, I could call and beg, they just use it as an excuse and say, oh, well, we can't do it because look what the policy says. Can't cross this line. But you can, because there's a person who controls that line. It's all about personal relationships. There are persons who make these decisions. And I'm not talking about bribery. There are persons who have the power to grant dispensations from certain rules or requirements based on their own judgment of the intentions of the person who requests those special permissions. And I've always found that they're available if I'm willing to ask. The same thing happened back in 2014 or so when we decided to apply to the state, to the University of North Carolina, and ask if they would give us permission to grant bachelor degrees to our students. And they did. They gave us permission to offer bachelor degrees. Yeah, me, us, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. That's another stick in the fire for us, as it were, waiting for the proper time. But we can offer our own bachelor degrees. And now the purpose of that was special. We wanted to offer a bachelor degree for young men or women who wanted to go to religious communities, because a lot of these communities require a bachelor's degree. And these young religiously minded men and women don't want to go immerse themselves in some secular university. They want to keep themselves in a spiritual discipline. And we thought making a bachelor degree available would help them to do that. And it will. And God willing, we'll pursue that route when students get to the point in their studies where it becomes an issue worth talking about. But most recently, with accreditation, anyone who would look at our program, see what we do, see what we teach, see how radical the things are that we promote, they would say, there's no way that this could ever get accredited. And there are parents who won't use our program because they can't imagine that a college or an accrediting agency or a future employer would ever accept something so strange as a classical liberal arts education. So I started to look at the requirements for accreditation, and I said, we can do this. Other people don't understand what they're talking about, but when I look at what the accrediting agencies are looking for, they're just looking for sincere educators. They're looking to make sure that the kids are taken care of and actually are taught. They're looking to see that everything's run honestly. They're looking for integrity in the administration of these different programs. And I think we can do it. As strange as our program is in modern ideas, at least, not strange historically. Historically, it was the only program. But I said, we can get this thing accredited. And I don't think anyone believed me. I know my wife didn't believe me. She didn't even want to enter into this pursuit because she thought it was going to be miserable. But as soon as the discussion started, I just started writing emails, asking questions, poking around. Could I do this? Could I do this? Could we do this? Is this possible? Is this allowed? Are there any special provisions for this? Is there any way that we could this? All of the responses started coming in, and they were all positive as usual. I had my first meeting with the accreditation evaluators, and everything went perfectly. And the next thing I knew, we were in the midst of the beginning of the accreditation application. And to be honest, I wasn't sure if I wanted to even pursue that. And I was sort of half committed to it. But I was actually being contacted by the evaluators saying, hey, what's going on? We're looking forward to your next step. We're looking forward to your executive summary. We'd like to set up interviews for candidacy. And it became clear even to my wife that after our initial discussions and interview, they were pursuing us. And everything went through. All of the challenges worked themselves out by God's grace. And we were approved for candidacy, and now we're in the midst of this candidacy process and getting ready for accreditation. Now, the reason why I shared all of this personal stuff is because the point that I want to make is illustrated by my own experience. That we live in a generation where the lines that are drawn, the regulations that are drawn, the obstacles that appear to exist are really an illusion. I don't know how to describe it otherwise, but they're really an illusion. Because if your intentions are true, and if you really have the skill to do the things that you desire to do, and you're doing them for the right reasons, you're not just trying to make money, these people in these positions can discern that, and they're ready to work with us. But what I find is that Christian people like having excuses. They love these ideas. They love this idea that the government is this giant conspiracy organization that's working to secretly persecute. They love this idea of all of this conspiracy. And yeah, I know that they may be friendly, and they may, not even require the church to pay taxes, but really what's going on really behind the scenes is that they're out to get us. They're out to take our... And I find that Christians love this political conspiracy theory because it excuses them from taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. It's really an excuse. It's an excuse to send your kid to an inferior college. It's an excuse to have your kids get lower scores. It's an excuse to serve standards that aren't worthy of Christian education. It's an excuse to work less. It's an excuse to take responsibility for things that need to get done and step up to the plate and get them done. If we believe that the government is a giant anti-Christian conspiracy organization, we can pretend that hiding from all of the works that need to be done, because going into the public square is like putting the ring on in Lord of the Rings, or entering into the Matrix, rather than entering into the arena where we're supposed to be working. If we can continue to perpetuate this fantasy that the world itself, where we're supposed to be evangelizing and doing good works, is actually a giant trap, and the good people are those who stay out of it, we can justify, as laymen, we can justify not doing the work of the laity. And we can pretend that, for example, to have dads who don't work in secular professions but fart around the house all day, pretending that they're interested in spiritual books, we can pretend that that's what the laity is supposed to be doing, when that's not what the laity is supposed to be doing, and it's just an excuse to neglect the work of the laity. The mission of the laity, if you read the Catechism, is not to sit around meddling in ecclesiastical affairs, or to sit around the house trying to make some profound art out of feeding children. But the mission of the laity is actually to go into temporal affairs and direct them according to God's will. That's the work of the laity. And so if you've got a man who's not a priest, he's not a religious brother or monk, he's supposed to be engaged in temporal affairs, and he's supposed to be directing those affairs according to God's will. He's not supposed to be pretending that he's excused from temporal affairs. And this is what modern Christians love to do. They love to pretend that temporal affairs is just worldliness. The temporal affairs are the mission field for the laity. That's where the work of the laity gets done. But again, if you can spin the story that there's actually a lion outside in the street, this giant conspiracy government that's out to get the real good Christians, and the way that you prove yourself to be a real good Christian is by staying in the house, by hiding in the upper room, by talking about spiritual things like the liturgy and like the vestments of the priest and all kinds of historic church documents, rather than getting your butt engaged in temporal affairs and directing temporal affairs according to God's will, that your absence from the arena is a sign of some kind of piety, you're just fooling yourself. And that's why this reality that there's so much opportunity, that the lines are really just illusions. When I tell people this, I find that the Christian people that I talk to actually refuse to listen to me. They refuse to listen. They want the restrictions to be true. They want the conspiracy theories to be true, because as soon as we realize that they're not true and everything is open to us, they immediately realize that we're responsible to start working. And we should be getting these things done. We should be taking advantage of these opportunities. We should be changing these things. We should be creating better alternatives. We should be creating Christian alternatives. They don't want that to be true. They want it to be true that if you go into this field of business, you're basically receiving the mark of the beast. If you do this thing, you're being worldly. You're abandoning the Christian way. You're not being a good father because you're not hanging out with your kids all day long. You're not helping your wife to heat up milk bottles for the children. That's what a real Christian dad should do. That's a bunch of baloney. The laity is supposed to be directing temporal affairs according to God's will, and it's so easy for us to do so today. There are so many opportunities to renew things, change things, reform things, start new options in different things. So many opportunities. Almost no restrictions. And men and women are pretending, they're pretending that the obstacles exist, that don't exist. And I'll give you some more examples in education. I will have parents contact me in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and they'll ask if we have printed books. And I'll say, no, we don't use printed books. This is 2023. All of the study materials that we need access to are freely accessible. They're freely accessible through the tools that we have today in God's providence, freely accessible. So there's no need to limit our studies to what books we can afford or what books are in print. Our access to knowledge and learning is unlimited. But the parents will actually refuse to study digital materials and intentionally limit themselves to what's in print or what they can afford in print. And so pretending like we're living in 1980, we're going to pretend that we can only study printed materials because the implications, if we're able to study digital resources, all of the minimum standards have no more excuse. There's no more way to justify all of this K-12 minimum standards nonsense. And they know that. So they actually find ways to basically draw lines around themselves and pretend that there are limits. And as I tell them all the time, our studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy go so far and so wide that you would never be able to afford the books that you would need to study these things in print. There's no way. You will not be able to afford the books. And so the same parents who are asking for discounts on enrollment costs are insisting that they're only going to study with printed materials, which just makes no sense. It makes no sense. You can't afford to give your children this education with printed materials. You can't afford it. It would be like saying I'm only going to read what I can get in the form of illuminated manuscripts, and illuminated manuscripts cost tens of thousands of dollars, and then I'm going to say, oh well, then I guess I can only afford to study one book. But you're making that rule for yourself. You're creating, totally fabricating that restriction. And then they come up with this like conspiracy theory science that they just pull out of their hats whenever it's convenient and say, oh, well, it's because screen time is bad for kids. What does that even mean? What does that even mean? Where is the demonstrative scientific evidence that demonstrates that studying classical languages on a computer screen damages children? How is looking at pages of books scientifically proven to be safe, but looking at a screen on a tablet or a computer is dangerous? You see, they invent fence lines, they invent restrictions, they invent obstacles for themselves that don't exist. And so when the fence line is taken down and the sheep are given free access to whole new pastures, they say, oh, no, we can't go over there. Oh, no. We're going to invent a new reason why we shouldn't go into that new field. No, we need to stay over here. But the master took the fence line down. Oh, no. We need to stay over here because this and that fantasy rule that we make up is now our new fence line. And that's what Christians are doing. So they just spite themselves. As the restrictions are taken away and access is opened up, they impose restrictions on themselves to justify doing less, because they like the low standards. They like just covering the basic public school requirements. And when you're told, dude, you don't need to listen to the public school requirements anymore because it's not 1990. You're not limited to what's in the school library. You're not limited to the textbook that the public school gives your child. Education isn't bound up in that teacher in the classroom, in your hometown. You're not limited to the schools that happen to be available where you live or that you can afford. Now, all of a sudden, there's all of these new opportunities. They say, oh, no. We need to stick to our old restrictions here. No screen time. We don't like the internet. We don't like, we don't want to, and it's just excuses to maintain the secular low standards among Christian people. It's crazy, but that's what's true. Parents will contact me and ask me to help their children with the lessons, telling me that their children can't study, can't understand the lessons, even though they and their children have never even looked at the lessons yet. They're already convinced that they're dependent on one-on-one help from a teacher, which they can't afford. They're already convinced that they need special help, they need videos, they need special tutoring arrangements, they need special explanations. And I tell them, the way that our program is laid out, because we're not doing things the way modern schools do them, everything is already laid out. It's all self-paced, so you just work one task at a time. You don't need those things because you're not going to fall behind. You're not going to need tutors. It doesn't matter that you're a little slow or you think you're slow. It doesn't matter because it's self-paced. Those restrictions have been taken away. They will refuse to listen to me even though I have studied the courses and they haven't. They want the 1990 restrictions to be true. They want it to be true. They want to pretend that their education is limited to their access to special services and all kinds of expensive resources. They want to pretend that their learning is restricted when it's not. And so the key point that I want to focus on, and I'll bring this to an end as I do this, is that we live in a generation, and I'll give one more illustration that I want to share before I finish. Hopefully I'll remember. We live in a generation where the restrictions have been taken away. Access is blown wide open to things that were available in history to the most elite members of society, made wide open to us from our living rooms. And Christians are inventing excuses to not pursue them. They're inventing excuses to not pursue them. All of the conspiracy theories, all of the governments out to get us, the homeschool evaluators are out to get us, the accreditation agents are out to get us. They just want to take our kids away. They want to make us all get vaccinations. They want to give us all blood clots. Christians are perpetuating restrictions that no longer exist. And what's actually happening is meritocracy is being established where you've got access to everything. It's a question of who's going to use it. It's just a matter of who's going to use the resources and do it. And you're either going to sit there goofing around doing 1980s stuff, spending hours or days or weeks or even years doing things that could be done in seconds or minutes today, telling yourself it's necessary to do it that way. Just spiting yourself. And it's being done so that we can excuse our laziness. And that's why Proverbs says, I mentioned it before, Proverbs says that the sluggard says that there is a lion outside. The sluggard won't go outside because he doesn't want to work, so he'll pretend that there's some danger outside. Proverbs tells us about this character. The sluggard says there's a lion outside. We better not go out to work today because there's something dangerous out there. There's no danger, no extraordinary danger that isn't just natural to life. It's that you don't want to work, and you're making an excuse to avoid what you don't want to do and pretending that there's some kind of virtue in not doing what you should do. I'll give you another example in this accreditation process. As we got into it, we find like, there's all new policies, all new ways we do things, all new options. Oh yeah, what are these new options? Oh, well, the new way to do it, the new way that accreditation is done is that we give you the standards and you self-evaluate. And then we, the accreditation evaluators, we actually evaluate your self-evaluation. So the appearance of accreditation is not even what really happens. Sure, they give us the standards, and yes, there is an evaluation. But we do the evaluating. We prepare reports on what we're doing for them. We have to evaluate ourselves, grade ourselves. We do it. And then we present them with our self-evaluations and evidence of our self-evaluation. And then they evaluate our evaluations of our own work. And the reason why I'm sharing this is that the appearance of what's required for accreditation, if you actually take the accreditation challenge on and face it, doesn't even exist. It doesn't even exist. And it's great for us because we know what we're doing. We understand the standards that we're pursuing. We have this 2,000-year history of educational development behind us in our curriculum. We're very thoughtful with our evaluation policies, with our assessments, with record keeping, with administration. We're going to have no problem at all with this. But the only way we would even know that this was possible was by entering into it initially, not knowing that it was possible. And that's what I want to share with Christian people. We live in a generation where Christians are making excuses to justify surrendering every part of temporal affairs to secular influences. They justify surrendering every part of society to secular influences, pretending that surrendering is some kind of Christian strategy. Rather than creating Christian options, they simply boycott secular options. But they don't produce an alternative, even though they could. They could produce an alternative. They could produce a Christian alternative, but that's not their interest. They just want to complain, and then they'll use it as an excuse to not do something. Whereas there's no reason why they're not creating Christian alternatives to these things. Why can only unbelievers start businesses and produce products and develop different industries? Why does it seem that only unbelievers can do any work? Because the Christians have all surrounded themselves with this worm-tongue conspiracy theory craziness. And they all sit around telling themselves that there's a lion outside and that the best thing for Christians to do is just stay inside. Just surrender that, give that up. Let them take that over, let them do that. We're just going to continually retreat and retreat and retreat, and you know what's going to happen? What's going to happen is all the unbelievers are going to actually get control of all the different parts of society, and then the Christians will say, you see, we told you it was all bad. But that's what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they are actually the cause of what they pretend they're suffering. And that's what's happening in modern Christian society. Christians are handing the keys to unbelievers, and then when unbelievers begin to direct temporal affairs according to their philosophies and according to their goals, the Christians say, see, we told you this stuff is bad. That's why we just need to keep retreating and retreating and surrendering and surrendering. And it's all a lie. It's all a lie. We live in a society where there is freedom to do almost anything as a Christian. Start businesses, start schools, start colleges, educate your own children. The freedoms that we have as Christians, I don't know that they've ever existed in world history. The resources available, the opportunities we have available, again, I don't know that they've ever existed in history. Access to learning and learning resources, unprecedented. And Christians are wasting it all, making excuses, why they can't use these resources, why they can't take advantage of this access, why they shouldn't be pursuing higher standards and achieving greater things. They're making up reasons to continue doing less when the opportunity to do more is available to them. And this is what's going on in modern society. Technology has created a meritocracy that has busted entire fields and industries wide open to whoever's willing to do the work. And we're not doing the work. We're simply getting outworked by other people. For all of our talk about virtue and all of our talk about ora et labora, we're not doing the work. We're getting outworked in temporal affairs by people who oppose the religion that we claim to hold. Christians are being outworked by non-Christians. When Christians have access to anything they want, any education they want, any skills they want, any business opportunities they want, if they're willing to work for them, they're clinging to fabricated boogeyman stories to justify doing nothing. And there's no excuse for it. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, as an example, Catholic kids have access to a system of education that only princes and nobles had access to in the past. It's available to them for almost nothing. You know how many Catholics are using it? Hardly any. Hardly any. When I look at what kids are actually working on, they have access to classical mathematics, philosophy, classical languages. They're goofing around in modern arithmetic, worried about grade level standards that no one cares about. The colleges don't care about them. No school evaluators care about them. The parents are pretending that these things are important. Just pretending. So that they can continue to buy boxes of school supplies that give kids activities that show them how to add fractions. It's just this perpetual baby culture that never matures. They never advance. They never advance. They just keep reaching backwards to simpler and simpler things, trying to make simpler things more and more complicated and expensive so they can justify staying in the simple things. When the whole entire curriculum, all the way up through classical philosophy, scholastic theology, it's all open before them, and they will sit around kicking rocks in the most basic modern courses for 10 years when no one is even asking them to do that. Just refusing to advance. And if I tell them, just complete the lessons as instructed, complete the assessments, submit the assessments, and move forward. No. We've got reasons why we've got to go backwards. We've got to leave off this advanced course and go back to a simpler course. We've got to make sure that and it's just an excuse to constantly go backwards and stay in baby stuff. And that's modern Christian culture. It doesn't matter if we remove the obstacles. What we see in modern society is that this lack of progress, lack of quality, lack of ambition is intentional. It's intentional because the restrictions are being taken away and we're still doing the same things like sheep that won't cross the line when the fence has been taken away. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I can vouch for our academy. The fence lines have been taken down, and there are a handful of kids who are getting after it, and they're going to do great things, but most of the Christians, They're just inventing obstacles for themselves. They won't listen to advice. They won't listen to instructions. And they end up, by their own rules and restrictions that they impose upon themselves, they end up failing and quitting. And it's almost like they're relieved when they can finally quit and just go back to the modern study program and pretend it's 1990. That's what I've observed, both in my own studies and work, that in this generation, study and work is wide open to us. We can do whatever we're willing to work for. It's not a financial issue anymore. It's not an issue of connections or qualifications. Things are wide open. College admission is wide open. Financial aid is wide open. There's no excuse for why Christians aren't leading in every field, except that they're not working. They're not taking advantage of these opportunities. Instead, they're wasting them and making up, what they are working at is making up excuses for why they can't do anything.